Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me. Now, in the last lesson, you'll have been looking at how the role of women changed from the 1920s through to the 1950s, and you should now have created an understanding of that period and how the role of women did change, not for everybody, but it changed for a lot. However, they still didn't have equality with men. So we're going to look at that in more detail today. Now, first of all, I've put an advertisement in front of you. It's an advertisement from the 1950s, and it's for a vacuum cleaner, a Hoover, the brand name for vacuum cleaners. Now, I want you to take a look at that advertisement. Press pause if you want. And it's almost comical. Today, it's almost bizarre that this is the advertisement, but let's have a look at it. It's a 1950s advertisement. Now, what does it tell you about the role of women in this period? What's the woman doing? What does the text say? Christmas morning, she'll be happy with a Hoover. What does that tell you about the role of women? What does it tell you about society in this period? Where are women placed in society? What is the expected role of women in society during this period? Don't forget, we're in the 1950s. And now I want you to think, would you see an advertisement like this today? Would you expect to see something like that on television, on YouTube, on social media? Would you expect to see essentially a cleaning appliance or a kitchen appliance being advertised in such a way? And why not? Because I'd like to think we wouldn't see something like that today. We'd almost find it bizarre, offensive. So why have things changed? Why is that not acceptable today? I want to look at something else as well. In 1965, we've got a table of the average wages for each industry, factory workers, service industries, and so on. And you can see the average wage or a salary for a man and the average wage or a salary for a woman. I'm going to give you a couple of moments to have a look at that. So press pause and just have a look at those figures. Now, hopefully, you've seen straight away that women are being paid less than men. So why do you think that is? Why do you think women are being paid less than men in the early 1960s? And the next question is, how do you think women are going to react to that information when they find out, when they realise that there is such a difference in their salary compared to a man? How do you think they're going to react? We've got quite a bit of background information there, so I now want you to put a subheading in your notes, and that's going to be the Presidential Commission for the Status of Women. Again, pause the video, give yourself a chance to write that down, and then move on. Now, in 1963, President Kennedy sets up a commission to report on women in the workplace. And it reports that women earn 60% less than men for the same job. It also identifies that 95% of managers are men. The majority of women are working in part-time jobs or with limited responsibility. They aren't the managers, they aren't the people in charge. It's men that have got that position. The report also identifies that only 4% of lawyers and 7% of doctors are women. Now, to be a lawyer, to be a doctor, you've got to be highly qualified. You have to have gone to university. It's a professional career. And yet it's clear women aren't able to get into that profession or those professions. And that in some jobs, for example, flight attendants, women could be fired if they got married. So you need to make notes on that. You need to identify the problems that this commission has identified. Press pause to do that before we move on to the next subheading. And our next subheading is going to be the Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. So again, press pause, write that down, and then we're ready to move on. Now, 1963 also sees the publication of the book The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. In this book, she argues that middle-class women are essentially trapped in the home. They want to break out of the home, but they're trapped by housework, by doing all the chores and jobs that women have traditionally been expected to do. And this book becomes a bestseller, and we see the phrase women's liberation being used a lot more to describe this movement. Now, I've put a quote up in front of you directly out of that book. So again, pause the video and read the quote. What is Friedan saying here when she's talking about the role of women and how they are going to be feeling about it? Spend a few moments thinking about that, and then we're going to move on to our next piece. And the final subheading we're going to have for today is the National Organisation for Women, otherwise known as NOW. So I want you to put that into your notes. Again, press pause to make sure you've caught up, and then we're ready to move on. And in 1966, a group of women, including the author Betty Friedan, set up a group, the National Organisation for Women, and they're going to start fighting for women's rights. They've been inspired by seeing the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King and his achievements. They've seen the protests about the Vietnam War, and they realise that they have to protest if they want their voices to be heard. Now, it has a movement of 40,000 members. However, most of them are white and middle class. Can you see any issues with that? Who's not being represented here? Essentially, it's African Americans and it's poor people. So this is a very middle class, mainly white movement, fighting for the rights of women, fighting for the rights of all women. But it's important to identify that it's mainly white, middle class that are driving this movement. Now, they produce a Bill of Rights. This phrase, the Bill of Rights, it is a really important phrase in America. It defines their values, and I've put a few examples in front of you. So the right to free speech, to say what you believe, that's Amendment 1 of the Bill of Rights. The right to bear arms is Amendment 2. The right for security, that's Amendment 4. For due process of law, to ensure you get a fair trial, is Amendment 7. You can see how the Bill of Rights is a really important document in America. So why do you think NOW call their document the Bill of Rights? They could have called it a manifesto. They could have called it a list of things we want. But they called it a Bill of Rights. That's really important because they wanted people to understand that this was important, this was serious, and this was going to be the foundation for what they believed in. Now, I've put the Bill of Rights up for you to see. You can see all 8 of them. You don't need to memorise them, but I want you to read them and you get an idea of what they are fighting for. And try to identify those key issues. I would say it's to stop discrimination within employment, to get fair pay, and the right for women to control their reproductive lives, birth control. So there we have it. We've looked at the key aspects for the development of feminism in the 1960s. So what I want you to do this week, I now want you to describe 2 problems facing women in the 1960s. A good place to look for this will be to look at the report that President Kennedy had produced. It's a 4-mark question, so I'm only expecting 1 paragraph, and it should only take you 5 minutes to write this answer. However, that 5 minutes does not include the whole lesson, so you need to spend a lot longer preparing for this answer. Make sure you've read through the material, make sure you've done the research, and then you'll be in a good position to answer this. So there's your question. Describe 2 problems facing women in 1960s America. In the next lesson we'll move on. We'll start looking at what's known as the Equal Rights Amendment and a piece of legislation known as Roe versus Wade, which is very controversial even today in America. However, you've got your work for this lesson. I'll leave you to it. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.